Learner students, Mr. Williams back, taking you through another subsection here from section 14, the 1990s. With the fall of the Soviet Union, one superpower remains on planet Earth at the beginning of the 90s and will maintain singular individual superpower supremacy throughout this era, and that is the US of A. So kind of circling back to section 13 and the fall of Soviet communism. That superpower is no more. So this Cold War, this almost all-consuming situation for geopolitics for the better part of 5 decades is over. It's no more. Most individuals believe we are entering into, the title of one of the CNN episodes that's linked in the calendar, a new world order. With the United States of America kind of being the law enforcement entity. Yeah, we have the United Nations, but the US of A obviously carrying a certain level of weight, internationally speaking, when it came to certain affairs, that we were going to have this coalition of free states, okay? Nations that champion democracy, republicanism, free will, liberty, etc. We're going to have a coalition of those free states through the United Nations and, individual efforts from some of the more powerful, prominent nations on the world stage, that they were going to establish this new world order, that it's no longer you're either with the Soviets or you're with the West, okay, and trying to carve out your place in international society. This new world order is kind of everybody coming down and sitting at the table and playing by the rules established by free society across the globe. From this new world order, it was believed, it was hoped, okay, kind of circling back almost to the beginning of the school year when we talked Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points. It was kind of hoped that we are going to enter into this new era of peace, all right, that nuclear weapons would be slowly dialed back, placed into the hands of only nations that could be trusted, and militaries, size, scope, and scale would also be trimmed back. So we're going to hopefully, with only one superpower remaining, okay, hopefully that superpower not being threatening to the presence of free nations abroad, that we're going to enter into this era of peace, internationally speaking, but we go from one international situation of paranoia to the next, okay? The absence of the Soviet Union creates a power vacuum in certain areas of the world. And with the lack of oversight or oppressive control that was once present, somebody is going to rise to the occasion and look to seize such opportunities of being powerful and influential. So, most notably in Eastern Europe, starting before the fall of Soviet communism and then revving up substantially thereafter, we've got ethnic affairs. Okay, so most notably in Yugoslavia, pictured here to the top right of your screen. Places like Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo. We have areas of the old Yugoslavia, okay? A nation that was created after World War II, basically putting a lot of ethnic groups together. Populations that were at times at war with each other for decades to centuries. They're now living under one flag. Well, there's independence declared and civil war that follows in the early 90s through the mid to late 90s in some of these situations, okay? In some of these situations, it takes years to actually sort out who is in charge and to redraw some of the boundaries and some of the borders for these nations, okay? So it's a bloody affair. Unfortunately, the New World Order, per se, of peace and diplomatic solutions does not take root in some of these Eastern European areas through the 90s, okay? Communists, for the most part, had always kept the peace between these ethnic groups because if they stepped out of line, they were going to be beaten into submission by the Soviet Union. But with no one to stop them now from stepping out of line, the stepping out of line results in civil war, and in some situations, efforts of ethnic cleansing, all right, to where one ethnic group is trying to rid the world of the other, all right? So several affairs through the 90s, most notably in some of these Balkan states where civil war rages on until finally somebody has claimed enough of a toehold to institute some form of government that is now in present day world order, okay, recognized as a sovereign state. Some examples in Africa where the Soviet Union had a bit of a toehold or had propped up certain warlords to run some of these nations. Somalia and Rwanda, where millions are actually going to lose their lives. The situation in Somalia still raging on to this day, okay, where there is somewhat of a government established, but it is not in control of the entire nation. You've had international groups, most notably the United Nations, support efforts in Somalia off and on over the better part of 2 decades, with a mixed bag of results. Rwanda, we had genocide, which was the government that was in control. Lots of history here, just to kind of, again, save some time. You could look this up on your own. This will also be discussed in a New World Order video, so make sure you check that out. That's linked in the calendar doc from CNN there. You had one ethnic group claim authority of the Rwandan government and ultimately, systematically, similar to Hitler's execution of the Jewish people, you're going to have one ethnic group in Rwanda line up and systematically rid Rwanda of their adversarial ethnic group. Okay, so absolutely awful, horrendous stuff. The situations in Somalia and Rwanda, the United States of America dabbled in from time to time, but for the most part, what Western nations have done is kind of assist some of the neighboring nations to Somalia and Rwanda in efforts to guide those warring populations to a peaceful conclusion and ultimately setting up a government that is representative of the demographic in that nation, in those borders, and again, does justice to majority desire with respect to minority rights. It's tough stuff, okay? Tough stuff. Complex stuff that we just can't knock out in like a 5 to 10 minute screencast, but we want to touch on it. These were some of the geopolitical international affairs that were captivating American politicians and Americans alike during an era when, as we talked about in the last subsection, a lot of Americans were feeling good about where they were in America, how things were going for them as an American. So we're no longer worrying about the Soviet Union abroad. These are some situations that are flaring up around the globe that Americans are concerned about because it could affect American policy and American lives going forward. But most notably, we are, again, holding the torch. Get my hand in front of the camera there, holding the torch for liberty, free will, democratic republicanism. And if we are going to talk the talk, we got to walk the walk. And some of the walking of the walk is supporting the establishment of free societies or supporting those looking to establish free societies abroad. Another threat, okay, so the first threat would be the collapse of the Soviet Union, ethnic war in Europe and Africa. Okay, that's threatening the New World Order, peace across the globe after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. The second threat is the rise of terrorism, both at home and abroad, but noticeably at home. Terrorism, something that we talked about when we looked at Section 13 with Ronald Reagan, some of his geopolitical foreign diplomacy mishandlings or mishappenings dealt with the threat of terrorism. Okay, Beirut, Lebanon, the situation with Gaddafi in Libya, just the Middle East in general. We see a rise of domestic terrorism in the 1990s. The rise of terrorism is another episode from CNN's The 90s that I encourage you to watch. A bit of a disclaimer here. It's a left-leaning documentary series. it's going to chastise, it's going to group again the idea of conservative values and leaning to the right with being very, very radical right. But as I stated in one of our earlier subsection Screencast, it's not a linear spectrum. You start to get further and further away from the center. That stuff starts to bend backwards. If you are a extreme Antifa leftist ideologue and you are a radical rightist, you are more closely related to each other than you are either side of the spectrum that you supposedly represent. But nevertheless, we see a rise in domestic terrorism, and a lot of it is rooted in how the federal government handled some of these militant groups that are rooted in some Nazi Aryan race ideology, how they handled some of these groups in the early 90s. So you have the situation in northern Idaho, followed up with David Koresh in Waco. That's a fabulous Netflix series, I haven't watched it yet. I need to check it out. But that leads us to the 1995 Oklahoma City federal building bombing by Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh would have been essentially proxy, associated with some of those radical rightists that were associated with Aryan belief in the early to mid 1990s and lashing out against an unjust federal government. Timothy McVeigh decides to make a statement, gain popularity, if you will, for his mindset, his ideology, and 168 individuals lose their lives because of that. All right, absolutely devastating, tragic incident. You've got the picture of the Murrow Federal Building in Oklahoma City in 1995. Drives a Ryder truck into the parking garage underneath. It explodes, and unfortunately, 168 individuals lose their lives. Couple of documentaries on this available through Netflix as well. If you're interested in it, make sure you definitely check those things out. It's touched on in the CNN The Rise of Terrorism video. We also see school shootings make their debut, for lack of a better term, in the 1990s, most notably with the Combine school shooting where 13 individuals are killed, dozens of others are wounded. You have a couple of kids who had plotted essentially to wage death and destruction on their classmates, on their school in this Denver suburb. This, again, is talked about, I think, very well, so where some things may not be, in my mind, given a fair shake or described accurately in some of the CNN documentaries, I think this one is spot on. And it's been something just recently that the national media has finally been cognizant of. The idea that in the 1990s, we have a movement in terms of terrorism. We have a movement from being like politically or socially charged. So like retaliation to American actions abroad. All right, that's what really fuels Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, many of these Middle Eastern terrorists. They're lashing out against American involvement, American presence, historically or presently around the globe. Some instances of domestic terror, it's lashing out against actions of the national government. Timothy McVeigh would have been one of those situations. The bombing in the Olympic Village in 1996 in Atlanta, another one of those situations. The rise of some radical rightist, militant right in the Great Northwest. Heck, we had a situation like that recently. We had another situation in San Bernardino in California recently for those situations. So domestic terrorism that's politically motivated. These school shootings, that's not the case. I think CNN does a solid job of describing how we see a situation where almost some of these not amazingly settled individuals, mentally speaking, are basically lashing out for fame, infamy. The way that they're covered by the media, the way that their story is described and propagated, it props them up on a pedestal. Similar to the motives, if you study it, behind Lee Harvey Oswald, the motives behind John Wilkes Booth. Wilkes Booth might have been a little bit more politically motivated. Harvey Oswald, a little more politically motivated. But still, they're looking for that I'm great moment, that people will recognize me. I think the CNN documentary regarding the Combine shooting, it finally kind of opens the door to how the media gives coverage to acts of terrorism. And for the better part of the aughts and the teens, some of these domestic terrorists, whether it was shootings in nightclubs in Florida or shootings at school, they're not celebrated, but they're given an unwarranted level of attention, individual attention, by the national media. And thankfully, the national media has finally started to kind of get away from that, where maybe we might start seeing some of these acts of domestic terrorism dissipate because they're not given the level of attention that they were back in the 1990s. So again, a little bit of a fascinating topic to discuss. Check out the video. It does a good job, in my opinion, of discussing exactly that. In the areas of foreign terrorism, we've got the seeds of 9/11 sown by Osama bin Laden and some of his additional associates, part of the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. The World Trade Center, believe it or not, 9/11 was not the first time that place was attacked. You got to go back to 1993 when an effort through a bomb similar to what Timothy McVeigh used at Oklahoma City explode the parking garage, caused one tower to collapse into the other. It was not foiled, but it wasn't carried out successfully by Al-Qaeda operatives. We then have an Al-Qaeda ship crash into, okay, so basically a suicide mission, a United States destroyer at sea, the USS Cole. Each of these instances and several others across the globe are essentially dress rehearsals, if you will, for the big one, which was the 9/11 terrorist attacks organized by and carried out by the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. 9/11, again, you've got the airliners that are flown into each of the towers of the World Trade Center. We also have airliners, one that crashes in an open field thanks to the heroic efforts of passengers on that flight, and one that is crashed in the side of the Pentagon. So it's more than just the Twin Tower, okay? Some of these instances throughout the 90s, very early aughts, preparations basically for the big one that was 9/11. That does it, okay, for, I guess, some of the additional threats that now fill the void for what we were focused on for the better part of 50 years, and that was Soviet activity across the globe. The two items that mainly fill the void for paranoia's sake, or what Americans are worried about in terms of actions and policy and events: ethnic rivalry, civil war in Europe and in Africa, and then the rise of terrorism, both domestic and abroad. So in terms of America being the lone superpower and kind of guiding the world through some new situations, some new threats, those are the two major ones: ethnic war in Europe and in Africa, the rise of terrorism both at home and overseas. And that does it for this subsection. We'll pick it up next time. We'll wrap up our look at Section 14 in 1990s, talking about the Clinton presidency. Adios.